Most of the goodies have been handed out while we were getting ready. Our special treat tonight is Catherine Hernesh has come all the way up from southern New Jersey to give this training tonight. It's typically a 7-hour course. She has graciously, like an accordion, squeezed it into a 3-hour session. So we're gonna, unfortunately, have to kind of skip over some stuff. But you're going to have, correct me if I'm wrong, Catherine, but you're going to have the full course material at your disposal. Catherine will strategically skip over as necessary, but will point out the resources which you'll have access to and can read at your leisure.
Absolutely. Correct.
So with, everybody signed in, by the way? Good. You didn't get your vest, did you? Right? Good, okay. With that, please welcome Catherine Hernesh. Hey!
Hello.
Yay!
Hi, thank you. I want to start by thanking you all. I know this is your own time. I know probably most, if not all of you, spent the day at work, so I really appreciate you coming. I'm going to try to make it a really, really jam-packed 3 hours that'll go like this and be well worth your while and your time. Just a few really quick housekeeping things. So first, usually I would give out name tags so I could call on people by name. In the interest of time, I'm skipping that today. If you wouldn't mind, if you have something to say, just saying, hi, I'm, Roberta, and here's my question or comment or whatever it is. I'll try to remember your names. Please forgive me if I don't, and I just, kind of point your direction and say, yes, please share with us, okay? The other thing is you will hear a lot of gender-biased language tonight. So I want to be really clear about it. That is mostly for the convenience of the conversation. There are not just female, but male victims of domestic violence. We know this. We're going to talk about the numbers. But because the numbers of female victims are much greater than male victims, and because the domestic violence shelters within New Jersey serve women in the shelters themselves, there are other services for men, and we will speak about that. Typically, you'll hear me speak of victims as she and abusers as he. There are female abusers. There are male victims. We will talk about that as well. So when we're talking, I know somebody earlier said, what do you mean, Coalition for Battered Women? We're actually changing our name to reflect the fact that we serve male victims as well. That'll be coming within the next month or two. And the entire movement, you have to remember, this started as a grassroots movement in the late 70s, early 60s, to serve women who were being literally killed by their husbands, because at that time, nobody thought that was a problem. Until that time, women were the property of their husbands. Law enforcement really didn't have legal backing to intervene. And so women needed to get safe, and so the safe houses sprang up. And it was a grassroots movement, and really while there, I can guarantee you, were victims who were male at that time, they were not speaking out, and there was no awareness of that, okay? So please forgive the gender-biased language and understand and recognize that we recognize there are male victims and we do serve them. Any questions before we start? Okay, great. Here's how this will go. I hope this works. You guys are my test case for a 3-hour, 7-hour training. I didn't want you to lose out on any of the information. So your packets are the full training that I typically present. What you'll see is I really only took out about 4 slides. Kind of compressed them, combined them, and I took out a lot of the exercises just in the interest of time. I'm really sorry to have to do that. I may skip some slides, but if you see something on it that you're interested in or have a question about, give a shout out, raise a hand. I'm happy to stop, answer any questions. You do not want me standing in front of you for 3 hours just speaking at you. So please participate, ask questions. If you've experienced something that you think would benefit the group, or that's different than what I'm saying, or that you just want to share, please join in. I really like it to be interactive. And with that one, we get started.
Yeah, maybe just one other housekeeping item. Given that we're on kind of a tight schedule, if anyone needs to use the loo, if you will, just go back into the EOC, and that far corner over there is a unisex bathroom, which is kept very clean typically. So feel free to maybe just waltz out and waltz back in again. Is that fair?
Great, yeah, that's fantastic. Okay. Thank you. That reminds me of something else that I skipped. 2 people were kind enough to talk to me about their phones. I get that you guys are first responders. I also understand people have families. I just ask if you would please put your phones on vibrate or very low volume. I get it. If you have to take a call, just quietly go out, do what you have to, come back. It's a very flexible, very fluid training. I tend not to be very rigid about this. I don't yell, so no worries, okay? So these are our objectives. While we have shortened it, just one more thing. So I'll probably speak fairly quickly because I'm trying to get everything in. If I go too quickly, let me know. Okay, I'll slow it down.
And Charlie, she doesn't sound like she was born in Brooklyn, does she?
No.
I was. And I lived in Staten Island for 9 years. You would never imagine, would you? Okay, so we will define domestic violence and we will really get into the myths and the barriers. That's not a conversation I'm going to shorten because I think it's really important. Okay? The intersection between domestic violence and disasters, there's a very specific thing that happens. When you're looking at victims of domestic violence, these are people who are already traumatized, and now they're dealing with the trauma that the rest of us are dealing with because of whatever the disaster is. So everything tends to be amplified for them. So we're going to talk about, if you're working in a disaster shelter, how you might be able to recognize somebody who's living with or who has recently survived domestic violence, and not that you're going to counsel them. I don't expect to go through this and now you're all certified counselors. No. If you can identify them, we've got some resources that you can give out to them, right? That's the thing. It's just how can you best support this particular special needs population. We do look at victims and survivors of domestic violence as a special needs population because they are trauma survivors, okay? We use the terms victim and survivors interchangeably. Typically when I'm working with a client, I follow their lead. So if they refer to themselves as a victim, then I refer to them as a victim. If they refer to themselves as a survivor, I do that. Having worked as long as I have in the field, and I'll tell you that I've been in the counseling field this is my 11th year, fully half of that has been in domestic violence shelters, and a lot of the rest of it has been working with populations where domestic violence is a big issue, like at-risk children, where there's domestic violence very often in the families that I work with. So, while I will refer to a victim as a victim, if that's how she sees herself, I will also remind her that she survived the trauma, so she's a survivor, because we want to start working with people to look forward as opposed to being stuck in the victim status. No, you guys aren't going to counsel. You just want to go according to what they're saying. Just kind of some background information in case you do have an extended conversation with somebody. And some of the first responders I've worked with have told me some incidents that they have experienced when they were in shelters working with people. We'll look at the warning signs, ways to assess, support and safety plan. That'll probably be one of our shorter things. You guys already know what your assessment process is, and I'm not looking to add a whole nother process to it. It's really just little things to tweak it if you think somebody might be showing the red flags for domestic violence. So it's just a little tweaking. It's not a whole other assessment process. And then we'll look at compassion, fatigue, and resilience skills. I will tell you, as a therapist, every agency I've ever gone to, every place I've ever interviewed, every place I've ever worked, first thing when I come in, they say, how do you balance, work and your personal life? What do you do for good self-care? It's very important, right? First responder, domestic violence counselor, really stressful. Then I go to work, and it's never spoken of again, and we're really, really busy, and it all falls off the table. But if we can identify compassion fatigue and we build our resilience, we're going to do much better, we're going to be able to support people, and we're going to feel better. Okay, so Bruce, if you could go to the next section, please. Thank you. Can somebody read this slide, please?
Go, Joe.
Okay, the word disaster implies an incident that is intense, powerful, damaging, adverse, and extreme. Domestic violence is an ongoing disaster experienced at a personal level.
Thanks, Joe. So, again, when we're looking at the intersection of domestic violence and disaster, a disaster like a 9/11, or a disaster like Superstorm Sandy, those of us who have a stable family life, a safe home, enough money to take care of ourselves, feel like the rug has been pulled out from under us, right? I know I lost power for a week in Sandy. It was free. I was colder than I am now, hard to believe. And I had no water because I didn't believe the newscasters, because they always blow everything out to be bigger, right? So I really was off balance. Take somebody who on a daily basis is living in an intense, powerful, damaging, adverse, extreme environment, and then put that disaster on top of it. It's overwhelming. And you'll find that if you do recognize somebody as showing some red flags for being a victim of domestic violence, they probably are coping less well than some other people. They have fewer resources. I'm just going to advance that. Next slide. Okay, who will read our domestic violence definition, please? Thanks.
Domestic violence is a pattern of abusive behavior in any relationship that is used by one partner to gain or maintain power and control over another intimate partner. Domestic violence can be physical, sexual, emotional, economic, or psychological actions or threats of actions that influence another person. This includes any behaviors that intimidate, manipulate, humiliate, isolate, frighten, terrorize, coerce, threaten, blame, hurt, injure, or wound someone.
Right, thank you. That is probably the most mouthful of a definition I have ever seen in my life, and it's really accurate. So what in that speaks out to anybody? What kind of calls out to you that you're like, I didn't realize that, or wow, or whatever? What calls out to you guys? Yes.
I was talking to my mom actually earlier today. I was like, why are we just talking about domestic violence? Or isn't there more to it than just being violent? So I like that that's part of the definition.
Oh, good. Yeah, and that's a great question. We always think of domestic violence as one person coming and hauling off and hitting that other person. It's a pattern of behavior. It's coercing the partner. It's intimidating the partner. It's isolating the partner. It's financially restricting the partner. It is also physical violence. It's verbal abuse and emotional abuse. Anybody else? What kind of is like, wow, what in this shouts out to you?
Somebody trying to dominate the partner.
Absolutely. That is exactly what domestic violence is. It's one partner trying to exert power and control over the other partner, and these are all of the ways in which they do that. Anyone else? Okay. Really important to remember that it's a pattern. So while one partner, if we look at Ray Rice, if what they're saying is true, and I'll tell you as a domestic violence counselor, not a chance in hell that it's true. That it never happened before? Absolutely not. But if we go with what they're saying and it's true, that's still domestic violence because he hauled off and knocked her out, right? And they're in an intimate partner relationship. It's not the pattern. So when someone's telling you that that's the first incident, know right away that they're not telling you the truth. I guarantee you there's a pattern behind it, and here's why. Domestic violence escalates. It is not static. Think about your relationships with family members, with your partner, even with close friends. From the beginning to the point it is now, especially if they're long-term relationships, are they the same as when you first met that person? No. They're more intimate. You know them better. They know you better. Usually you're more comfortable. You speak with them more casually. You may do things they would have been embarrassed to do 3 years ago when you first met them, because now they know you and you know they're going to like you even if you do something stupid. Same is true of violence. Because part of the pattern is learning what your partner will accept, learning how far you can push. Right? Our perpetrators, one of their key skills is testing to see where the chinks are that they can get into. And so what may start as verbal abuse and domination will escalate to violence. I can't say it never is initially physically violent. It's really rare. It's really rare. Next. Okay, so the myths. I do want to spend time on this. You don't need me to read this to you, but there are a few things. Earlier today, who was it? Bill, I think you had said, well, Ray Rice lost his temper, right, and hit her, and I said it wasn't a loss of temper. And I'm so sorry I jumped right on that. It's almost an automatic response fit to me, because here's what happened. It's what happened for many, many years. is the abusers go to court, and the judge says, you need anger management. Well, anger management works if we lose our temper and don't know how to appropriately express our anger. Domestic violence is not a loss of temper. Domestic violence is a problem with our value system. It's a willingness to violate the emotional and physical boundaries of our partner, and anger management won't help it. So we're going to watch a video in a few minutes. That's a survivor speaking about her experience. And I don't want to step on her thing, so we'll talk more about it afterwards, but you'll hear the difference in why she thinks it was a choice that he made and not a loss of temper. And we'll talk about that afterwards. People can't walk away at any time. We're going to talk more about that later. Because of the pattern of abuse, because it involves withholding finances and isolation, which means you don't have people to reach out to, you may not have access to a car or other transportation. And I'll share with you that I had a client whose husband, over the course of a 20-year marriage, convinced her that public transportation would bring shame on the family. So if she took the bus, they would all have to, hide their heads forever. And she wasn't allowed to use the car because she was too stupid to drive. So she came to shelter, and we have a bus stop across from our shelter, literally across the street. And she couldn't get on the bus to go find a job because she had become brainwashed that it would bring shame on the family. They cannot leave at any time. It's a very, in some ways, insidious pattern of behavior that works away at somebody's self-esteem, sense of self, and makes it very hard to just say, well, I'm out of here, right? So if you're not living with it, it's very easy to say, I would never take that. But when you're in it and you've been subjected to it over the course of time, and it's kind of eroded, it's like a Chinese water torture, that little dread, and it's eroded who you thought you were, and kind of grew you into somebody else who feels insecure, who has been told repeatedly that other people are going to see how stupid you are, and they're not going to want to talk to you, so you don't feel that you can go out and talk to other people. You can't leave, because where would you go? And who would you talk to? Okay? This one I really, really want to talk about, mental illness. So when I've done this training for first responder teams, mental illness seems to be the one myth that people have a really hard time letting go of. I understand, look at this behavior and say, that person is not in their right mind. Who says to somebody, I love you, and then turns them into a pile of dirt? But that's what our abusers do. At the same time, the victims also not mentally ill. So we say, who could take that unless they're crazy? So how come it's not mental illness? How come 3% of abusers have documented, diagnosed severe mental illnesses, and about that amount or even less for victims? Again, it's a value system. It's what people believe they can do. It's what people believe they can accept. We're also going to talk about that the relationship typically doesn't start out overtly abusive, at least. There are usually some warning signs. Yeah?
It's also a pattern of learned behavior, though, isn't it?
A pattern of
Abusers are
learned or
often
chosen.
abused.
Learned or chosen. So
Right.
children who grow up in homes with abuse or are subjected to it have a much greater incidence, much greater chance of themselves becoming victims or perpetrators. But we do have people who get involved in relationships that become abusive, who have no reported history. So it's more likely, but not the only reason. It definitely is the pattern of behavior. It can be learned, but it can also be a choice. It can also be a choice.
Given that mental illness covers such a wide range, like, wouldn't you find, say, a psychopath being more not used to, but more prevalent of being involved in some sort of abusive relationship?
Not necessarily. So I don't want to get too far into the DSM-4 or DSM-5 now in mental health diagnoses, but for instance, psychopathy is actually antisocial personality disorder. It's on the string of personality disorders, so there's narcissism, there's borderline, there's antisocial personality disorder, and there's, which is sociopathy, and then there's psychopathy. typically, those personality disorders, people act specifically out of a need to fill something in them that they feel is not getting met. In the case specifically of sociopathy or psychopathy, those people tend to fly below the radar until things become overwhelming for them. So they did a very interesting study, and some crazy number, like 73% of CEOs have antisocial personality disorder. They're sociopathic. Like really high like that. Run major corporations. If you know the personality disorders, it makes sense, because these are driven people who don't worry about running over other people. They go after what they want. They don't care who they hurt. It doesn't really translate to personal relationships. They're not good in personal relationships. You will find a very cold partner in your common everyday sociopath or psychopath. And there are very few psychopaths, because those tend to be your killers, not in intimate partner relationships, though. More like serial killers and things like that. Other questions about mental health? Really, really important. These are people like you and me. And I really mean that. I will tell you, like my 3rd year in shelter, we had a client come in. She herself had been a domestic violence counselor for about 15 years. This can happen to anybody. And not because they're mentally ill. It's a process. So part of the pattern wears away at the victim. It's a process. Okay? We've already discussed men certainly can be victims. When I'm in shelter, I work not just with the direct clients, but I also work the hotline. It's a 24-hour hotline. And I do get calls from male victims. So while the shelter is not set up to bring in male victims, if they're not designed that way, across the country, as they're building new domestic violence shelters, they are trying to build them in such a way that they can have a separate area for rooms for male victims. It's not comfortable for people who've been victimized by one gender to be with that gender in the shelter. It doesn't feel safe, but we want to be able to reach out. In New Jersey, all the shelters are kind of set. A lot of them were refurbished and redone about 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And at that time, they weren't looking at supporting male victims within the shelter, but we will arrange safe housing for them, not in a homeless shelter that's not safe. We will arrange safe housing for them, and we offer them the same counseling services that female victims get. So they do get all of the services. Any questions about any of these myths or comments? Okay, that's good. Okay, so the numbers, really quickly, 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men. These are reported numbers. We believe they're highly, highly underreported from both genders. 1 in 3 women who's a victim of homicide every year, murdered by her current or former partner. 1 in 3 every year is murdered by her current or former partner. Who knows the most dangerous time for a domestic violence victim? It is a very dangerous time, but not the most dangerous.
What was the answer? What was the...
Pregnancy, very dangerous, increases violence tremendously. Still not the most dangerous, though. Probably the second most dangerous. That was an excellent answer. What's the most dangerous?
Holidays?
Holidays, increased stress, absolutely. The most dangerous time is when she tries to leave, directly before or after. There's 1 in 3 women who's a victim of homicide. Those who are murdered by her current partner, it's typically within the first 30 days to 6 months. So when you watch the news and you see that man whose wife just left him 2 months ago and he's at her job killing her and her co-workers, not unusual for domestic violence, unfortunately. The mental health care visits, more than 18.5 million each year from intimate partner violence, is not because people are mentally ill. But think about if your partner, the person you love, that you most trust with your, literally your very life, with your innermost thoughts, with what you thought your future was going to be, every day is telling you what a worthless piece of garbage you are, putting you down, keeping you from having money, ruining your job, telling the kids, mom's stupid, don't listen to her. You'd probably be pretty depressed too. You might develop an anxiety disorder and want to go see a mental health counselor. So what happens is while people go into these relationships, do not have major mental health issues, it's not uncommon for them to develop a diagnosable mental health issue. Still not a major mental health issue like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, which people think of a lot, but a depression or an anxiety disorder. Victims of domestic violence have a tremendous amount of post-traumatic stress disorder. Same exact symptoms as soldiers coming back from the war. A lot of them liken it to being in war every day, being attacked by their partner every day. So they have high rates of depression, sleep disturbances, anxiety, flashbacks, other emotional distress, very much like men returning from the war. So, yes, go ahead.
I'm assuming those are U.S. statistics, and if so,
These are all U.S. statistics.
is there any comparison to other nationalities?
I'll tell you, what I know is that they're comparable in other Western countries. It's difficult to do in other cultures, non-Western cultures, because what they consider acceptable is often absolutely unacceptable to us. So while we say no, those people are being abused, they don't look at it that way yet, although we are trying to help them, right? So we do have some stats. I'll read you guys some stats in a bit if I have the time, on some situations in other countries. Typically, these stats are the United States, and they are pretty, you can generalize them to other Western cultures. In some cultures, some Muslim countries, some Middle Eastern cultures, some of the Indian nations, it's looked at differently culturally, and so it's very difficult to get accurate statistics on it. It's a really good question. Okay, Tanya's story. This is a survivor's story. It's part of a project. She's one of the survivors that they recorded. I think she gives a great window into what it's like to live in one of these relationships. Okay. Is there a light? Excuse me, sir, can you get the light, please? Please, if you don't mind. Thank you. Oh, it's dark. Thank you. She lost her voice.
It's muted. It's muted. It was down bottom right.
Oh, is it? Okay, thanks.
Bottom.
Well, my perspective on his behavior is that he chose to batter me. When he would work or be out with his friends and they clearly made him upset, he would not choke them. He would not punch or smack, kick, or call them degrading names. But I would receive that punishment. And I believe that he wasn't crazy. He was not using drugs. He was not drinking. He didn't drink alcohol. He didn't even eat meat. So I do not believe that it's something that makes a person better. I do believe it's a choice in that maybe alcohol or drugs or maybe even mental illness might contribute to it being more severe. But I believe that domestic violence is a choice. I felt like I was living in hell. He painted my kitchen walls black. My living room walls were really like a burnt brown color. The hallway was a very dark green. And the whole house was dark. And his explanation for doing that was we have kids and so that they don't mess up the walls. But I had no say-so in his doing this. I came home from work one day and my kitchen walls were black. So if you can imagine black walls, that's what I lived with, and so did my kids. But I noticed my older son at the time, who's about 9, started wetting the bed. He started having nightmares. And my next son started being more of like short with his responses. He wouldn't talk a lot. I just felt that they were very aware and trying to be good, so to speak. Like they didn't want to be the cause of mommy getting hit or of an incident occurring. So I felt like they couldn't be kids. Well, the last night was when my ex-husband came in the house with a shopping cart full of blankets. And my younger son at the time went toward the shopping cart and he lunged at him like, no, stay away from that. I knew that all of the threats he had made toward me and all of the insinuations that he was really going to kill me and hurt me were probably going to come true that day. And he had threatened before that he had guns, or that he can get a gun, put me out of my misery. That was his favorite line. And I didn't want to believe that, because this was my husband. He was the father of my child. He was a father to my other sons, and I really didn't want to believe that it was possible that he could even dream of hurting me like that, although he had been hurting me all along. And so he never got to the shopping cart, thank God. The next day I was able to get out of the house and go to the precinct and ask for help. And when I came back to the house with the officers, again, he was his charming self, very calm and inviting for them to come in. I have nothing to hide, when in fact he had threatened to take the kids. And the officers were able to go into the bathroom, and there was some blood on the wall from when he had punched me in my nose. But he had cleaned up, so he thought. And they were able to, like within the tile, there was blood. So he was arrested because of that. And so began my journey with the legal system. What he did was he called from Rikers Island. He called the state central register, the anonymous child abuse hotline, and told them that I had hired him to kill my kids. And so the Administration for Children's Services, known as ACS, came into my life. And they began to investigate my children and I, which felt like I was being abused all over again. There were instances where the system did work, and there were instances where the system didn't work. Again, at a certain point, I was told to leave my job, quit my job, leave my apartment, get on public assistance, and just walk away from everything. And I was also threatened that if I went back to my apartment, that my children would be taken away from me. And I felt like I was being re-victimized. Like, why did I have to leave everything? And he was free to roam around and just live his life. Why was I being punished? Again, why wasn't someone holding him accountable for what he did to me?
So can we get the lights, please? Thank you very much. Luckily, there's only 2 videos, so Paul, I knew a lot to do that. So Tanya's story. Could you go back to that one, Bruce, please? Reactions, comments, what stood out to you?
I just have a question. She was talking about she was told to leave her job, by who? Her husband or the authorities?
Legal counsel. And
Legal
authorities.
counsel.
And that's not unusual.
Really?
I will tell you, I brought a client into shelter this past week who said, I'm going to call the bank and give my house over to her because the abuser knows where she lives. He doesn't live with her. She's deathly afraid of him. She said, I'll get another house. She's afraid for her life. What the authorities will tell you is if only his name or if only the abusing partner's name is on the lease or the deed to the house, or if both names are on it, it's whoever stays in the house last gets it. But if he wants to kill you and knows where the house is and has a key, he's probably going to leave, right? So that re-victimization is not the intention of the system. Unfortunately, right now, we're kind of with the best we can do, and that's what we have. So that re-victimization occurs really on a daily basis, quite frankly. Other things that stood out to me were questions or comments. Yes.
She had made the comment about he had reported her to the Carrie List, the child abuse hotline.
Yeah.
I'm surprised that when there was a police report and that the children were in the home, that the police just didn't already make a report to the protective services.
You know, I think it depends. It really varies from state to state what officers are required to do. And so wherever she was. Apparently that was not a requirement, and if the children, some states, if the children are not directly being injured, then it's not considered that a call to Children's Services needs to happen. What we know in working with domestic violence victims is that children suffer whether they're being directly hit or not, that their security in the world is completely impaired because their one parent is abusing the other parent. It's extremely damaging, but not legally mandated in every state. So laws are different from state to state, and obligations are different from state to state. As a domestic violence counselor, the client tells me that they know that they've been hurting their child, the husband's been hurting the child, their sister's been hurting them, that anybody's been hurting a child. I am legally obligated, legally mandated, really any adult in the state of New Jersey actually is. You must call Children's Services, DCPMP, the 800 number, and report the abuse. But when a woman comes to shelter with her children, as far as I'm concerned, she's gotten them safe. So unless she reports the partner actively hitting them, I don't have to call DCPMP. That makes sense? Yeah. Not uncommon for the abusive parent to report the non-abusive parent, the victim, to Children's Services, and it goes both ways. Males will report the female, females will report the male, bogusly. Very difficult to prove something that didn't happen. The children don't want to speak, don't want to implicate the parent if it did happen. Very difficult. It becomes really, really messy. I do have a lot of clients who come in who insist that they have not been abusive, but the open DCPMP case has their name on it, not their partner. And in observing the clients, I can usually tell if it's a warranted case or not. Sometimes it is and sometimes it's not. Other things from the video. So a couple of things that stood out for me the first time I saw this was, first of all, if you notice, one of the first things she says was, I believe it was a choice because he didn't haul off and whack his boss or his friends if he didn't like what they said. That speaks also to the question of whether or not it's a mental illness. If somebody has a true clinical diagnosis of a mental illness, they will behave that way across the board. They will not go to work and be completely stable and respond appropriately and be able to have a focused conversation and then go home and all of a sudden now they're mentally ill. So when you have somebody who can go to work and can tolerate being told that what the job they did wasn't good, or somebody says something to them they didn't like, and they can deal with their frustrations seemingly appropriately in the office, and they can go out with their friends, and we all know, even our best friends sometimes say things that are like, well, that wasn't really very nice, or I don't like that. Sometimes we're the ones who do it, because we're people. We do stuff like that, right? We don't haul off and whack them. We forgive them. We say, well, you know what, this is my friend who I usually have a great time. So sometimes we will say something. And yet that person goes home and the partner does something and right away they're stupid, they're cursing at them, they're putting them down, they're hurting them, they're throwing things at them, they're withholding things from them. That is not a mental illness, it is a choice. So I was so glad to hear her say this. I think this video is really the best one we could have chosen for this training because she covers everything. What about the house being painted in black, brown, and dark green? How'd you like to live in that? Very cheerful, right?
When you talk about mental illness, what's the difference between mental illness and personality disorders? Or maybe consider just one and the same?
Actually, a personality disorder falls under the umbrella of mental illness. It's a great question. When we think of mental illness, we tend to think of behaviors that typically are unusual and might be scary. So people with schizophrenia who respond to internal stimuli, they're talking to themselves, we don't know why. They might not have good hygiene, they look a little weird, scary. People with bipolar disorder, if they're in a manic phase and they're running around and they're shopping and they're so happy, or now all of a sudden they're really angry, like on a dime, is a little scary. And we think of that as mental illness, and it is. Personality disorders are also a mental illness. The behaviors, in many cases, although not all, are not quite as extreme as those. However, it tremendously impairs the functioning of those people. What I will tell you is most people with a mental illness are much more vulnerable to being hurt than they are to hurting others. Much, much, much more vulnerable. And much more vulnerable to being self-harming than to harming others. Yes?
The business about showing one face in your work environment and another face at home.
Is
it's largely conditioned because it's unacceptable to call your boss an idiot, even if you think he is. It's largely unacceptable to call your co-workers idiots.
It's true.
But you can get away with, you're still angry when you get home. So unfortunately, that's where the anger comes out. So maybe the problem is anger management, really.
I'll tell you why not. I'll tell you why.
Okay.
Because if I go to work and have a bad day, I don't think I have a right to come home and take it out on my partner.
I didn't say you had a right. I just said that's the way it works.
But people who engage in abuse believe it's their right.
I don't.
They do. It's a values question. If you have a bad day and you come home and take it out on your partner on a regular basis, you're abusive. If you learn the skills to handle your anger in an appropriate way, you're not going to do that. But people who engage in abuse of their partners are not looking for a release of anger. They're looking to control that person, and often they're looking to destroy that person, right? There's a whole psychological component. You know, people, what do the abusers feel like? Well, a lot of them are very insecure, and so they suck it up at work when their boss tells them they did a bad job. They're afraid of losing their job, and they don't want to hurt their boss, and they think the boss is probably right because I'm a worthless piece of garbage, so I'm going to go home, and if you married me, you must be worse than I am because you married a worthless piece of garbage. So I'm going to project all of my self-hate onto you, then I'm going to beat the heck out of you. That happens in a large majority. That's what's going on. That's the underlying dynamic. Somebody who has a bad day at work and comes home and takes it out on their spouse, maybe could use some anger management, but that's not what we're talking about, right? We're talking about a pattern of ongoing abusive behavior. And I will tell you that the person who can't control his anger at home that way, if it's an anger management issue, will have anger management issues at work. And they do, right? I don't know about you guys, I have been in offices where there's the one guy that you're like, oh, don't cross him, right? Or someone's like he's explosive. So they might not fall off and hit their boss or their coworker, but they'll say something really nasty, snarl. Anybody ever witnessed that? Yeah. That's an anger management issue. Your typical abuser, whether male or female, is almost always charismatic and charming. People love them. One of the biggest problems in reporting domestic violence for male or female victims is that they are afraid nobody will believe them because everybody loves the abusive partner. Because in public, it really is a false face. So they would not just be coming home and snapping. It's a life issue. It's an ongoing issue. It can be difficult to kind of wrap your head around it. I don't expect in a 3-hour training you're going to be like, oh yeah, complete understanding of mental health and the whole thing. But just to know, it is not an anger management issue. Anger management classes for abusive people fail almost 100%. Almost 100% of those people go back and battle their partners kind of immediately. Like they'll go home from the anger management class and abuse, literally. We do have batterers intervention programs throughout the state now. Most of our shelters offer. They're called batterers intervention programs. JPWS, which is our Morris County shelter, has what's called ACT, Abuse Ceases Today. You can see from the handouts that are in your pamphlets that they actually have for youth, abusing youth, to help kind of catch it while it's young, because we do see teen violence. But also for grown men, there's also groups for women in Abuse Ceases Today because of the women abusers. It does not work on an anger management principle. It's not an anger management issue. I know that's a really hard concept because it seems like it, but it's not. And it's not mental health. But going back to mental health, so she was in a black kitchen, green hallway, brown walls in the living room. What color are your homes? Anybody have that color scheme? No? I can think of nothing more depressing than an all-dark home. And if you think of people who get SAD, seasonal affective disorder, because it's too dark and too early in the winter, try to live your whole life in that. Right? So there's psychological warfare. And the fact that it was done without her consent. She said, I didn't even have a choice. This is something you'll see in abusive relationships very, very often. The victim does not have a choice. The abusive partner unilaterally makes decisions, and you live with them, or there's an incident. Okay. So this is a power and control wheel. Has anybody ever seen this? Okay, so can I ask where you've seen that?
We went over it in health. It was a dating control wheel at that point, but it's the same thing.
It is the same thing, yeah. Good. We try to get this out as much as we can. So this was a project, the Domestic Abuse Intervention Project in Duluth. They came up with this wheel based on years of working with victims and abusers. And it's in your pamphlets. There's a full-size one in the back, so for legibility. Excuse me. What this is if you look at the wheel, on the outside there's violence, physical, sexual violence. And inside the wheel are all of the ways that the one partner can use, all of the tactics that they use to get power and control. Power and control in their relationship. And as the gentleman over here pointed out earlier, that's what it sounds like, that's what it is. The overriding goal of the abuser in a domestic violence relationship is to gain power and control over the victimized party. So it's not because they're mad, and it's not because they're mentally ill. It's because whatever their internal issue is, and it typically is, we know it is, low self-esteem and feelings of inadequacy. This person feels safe and comfortable at home to try to exert power and control over their partner to feel better about themselves. It does not work for them, which is why the violence tends to escalate. Because no matter how much power and control the abuser gets over their partner, it doesn't fix what they feel is wrong with someone. So it escalates. But these are all of the ways. Male privilege, economic abuse. I will tell you that for male victims, there actually is female privilege, and that women will use, well, nobody's going to listen to you because you're this big and I'm this little woman. Who's going to believe you? Who's going to believe you? Coercion and threats, all of these are ways. Now, does that mean every abuser uses all of them? Of course not. Although there are an unfortunate few victims who have had all of these things imposed. But some combination of these exist in every domestic violence relationship, and that's the pattern that we're talking about. So if one partner is isolating the other partner, you might see somebody who says, you know, your family hates me. We can't go there anymore. Okay, well, I'll go myself. And then you go yourself 2 or 3 times, and your abusive partner says, they're talking bad about me to you. You can't go there anymore either. And I don't like your friend. I don't like the way she looks at me. I don't want you to see her anymore. So little by little, all of your social supports are gone. So when your partner then has an escalated incident and hurts you, where do you turn? You don't have any place anymore. Isolation, a very effective tactic. Questions on the power and control wheel?
I'm having trouble reading it.
Yeah, you've got a full scale one in the back of your pamphlet.
Oh, well, I've got a little one, but...
Yeah, in the back there's a full page
Oh,
one.
I see. Oh,
There you go.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Yeah, so any of these that are hard to read, in the back there's a full scale diagram. So, with what we've spoken about so far, why would you think speaking out would be different? And feel free to look in the back at that power and control wheel. Look at the tactics, and let me know what you think about how or why it might make speaking out difficult for a victim.
It's lack of self-worth and also economic.
What about economic? How would that impact?
Well, where would I go? How would I exist?
Yes. Yeah. If you haven't been given any discretionary funds, where do you go? If you've been isolated from family or friends who otherwise might have taken you in, and you have no money to pay for a hotel, or even gas to gas up the car to get there, if you have access to a car, so bus or train fare, otherwise, if you're not living in an isolated community and there actually is public transportation, where do you go with no money? Why else is it difficult to speak out? Yes?
Some abusers threaten self-harm. They'll threaten to kill themselves if they leave.
If you leave, I'm going to kill myself. How would you like that on your head? right? Okay, I won't leave. Absolutely. What a frightening prospect. Yes?
The way that victims feel or why they don't leave, I think it has to do with, what they call the Stockholm syndrome, or people that are, say, kidnapped and start to like, say kidnap and murder. I know it's not a really question.
No.
Just off the cuff, is that same kind of thing?
Right, it's an excellent question. Was everybody able
Could you repeat
to
it?
hear her? Yeah, so she's asking, is one possible reason that women don't leave anything at all to do with Stockholm Syndrome? Are you guys familiar with Stockholm Syndrome? Right, so that's when a kidnapped victim begins to identify with their captor and begins to feel love for that captor and then becomes defensive of that captor, right? So we look at Patty Hearst. Way back when I was little, and everybody tells me I date myself. Oh well, I'm old. Well, get over it. Patty Hearst with the Sudanese Liberation Army, right? So she did end up going to jail, but there was a tremendous amount of discussion about whether or not she had Stockholm Syndrome because we saw pictures of her with the gun after having been kidnapped. And she was right there alongside of them, right? As far as with victims of domestic violence, typically people don't stay because of that, but there are strains of it. It's not uncommon to find even somebody who leaves an abusive relationship who is defensive of her partner's behavior, who has some Stockholm traits perhaps, right? Who might say, well, he did it, but here's why. So a lot of the work is around, is there ever a good reason to, I've got clients who have literally been blinded in one eye, lost the use of a limb because of abuse, permanently disfigured. I can think of no reason for your partner to do that to you. Literally no reason. And so part of the work that we do is in helping people see that even if your partner has reason to be upset, even if it's upset with you, they don't have the right to harm you that way, and you don't deserve that. So it feeds in that way, but that's not typically why people stay. Speaking out, there's still social stigma. Ray Rice. What were people's reactions when she married him after we saw the elevator scene?
Disbelief.
Disbelief. What else? I see you like nodding. But
She's crazy.
she's crazy.
She's crazy. Why would she do that?
Why would she do that? What else? I'll tell you I heard. Well, I guess she must like it. She married him after it happened. I guess she's okay with that.
Is it part of the conditioning? You mentioned this is longer-term pattern, and the victim doesn't know any other way.
In a lot of cases, absolutely. Very valid. Very valid. Yes, and then I see a hand here.
Isn't it possible the two people both have issues of their own, whatever they might be, where one person feeds off the other, or maybe one person has an
Yeah.
issue, and the other person has an issue, and somehow they
Yeah.
feel in their own little weird way that they complement each other or something?
In a very negative way, they complement each other. Yeah, absolutely. They were filling a really inappropriate need, perhaps. That does happen, absolutely. Sorry.
With Ray Rice, with the alcoholism, was that more brought out, like his actions or her actions?
I haven't heard a lot about that. What I will say is, when we looked at Tanya and she said he didn't even drink, he doesn't even eat meat. Right? Well, I know a lot of meat eaters who are not violent. And I know a lot of people who drink and they're not quote unquote meat drugs. So what we know about substance use and abuse is it does not cause domestic violence. So if you have somebody who becomes abusive or more abusive when they drink and they still choose to drink, then they're choosing to be abusive. So with Ray Rice, did you hear a tremendous amount of discussion about? I didn't either. And as far as the fiance marrying him after, I heard a lot of blame. So it's really hard to speak out because people say, well, what do you stay for? Well, economic is one really good reason and a very common reason. Social stigma, having nowhere to go because of the isolation. Fear for your children. It is very common for the abuser to threaten to take the children or harm the children or the family pet. It's hard to speak out because if you've been isolated, who do you talk to? Now, I will tell you, our shelter number and every shelter in the state comes up as a private number, so nobody can trace it. But strangely, we have had people, I'll answer the hotline and people will say, this number came up on my phone. Where did it come from? So I don't know what they're doing, star 16. I don't know how they get it because it comes up private number. I know our number doesn't go out there. We have had calls.
What do you say?
We say the truth. We're a 24-hour hotline. How can I help you? I don't tell them I'm sitting in the shelter. We're a 24-hour hotline. How can I help you? Well, I want to know who called. We give no information out ever. So it's kind of a dead end for them, but we do. And we don't get those calls all the time, but we do get them. But so speaking out, there's still tremendous social stigma, even though this is being talked about much more than it used to be. Yes?
Another barrier to speaking out is that the victim can start to believe what the abuser is saying.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Different than Stockholm Syndrome. It's more of a brainwashing that occurs. So over time, if you're not getting input from positive people, because now you've been cut off from friends and family, your abuser doesn't let you work, because I know you're going to flirt with the guys, you're not allowed to go there. And anyway, if you had that money, what would you do with it? I can't trust you. You're too stupid to know how to spend money. So you're isolated. The only input you're getting is from the abusive partner, who's telling you repeatedly how stupid and worthless you are and how nobody else would ever have you. And you begin to believe it because there's nothing counteracting it. Absolutely. It makes it very difficult to speak. Client I brought into shelter last week felt really guilty for being here. Really guilty because she had kids with her. What kind of mother brings her children to a domestic violence shelter? Well, the kind who wants them to be safe and not have their mother punched in the face like happened to her while she was in her truck. But it's really difficult and you start to believe it. So her belief was that she doesn't have a right to date. She's in her 30s. She is divorced. But if she didn't date, then she couldn't bring domestic violence in and her kids would be safe, so she's a bad person. And he as much told her so. When he punched her in the face, he said, you deserve it. If you didn't bother me so much, I wouldn't have to do this. It's a constant, common refrain. Both male and female abusers use it. It's your fault. If you weren't so stupid, annoying, irritating, pick your really negative adjective, it's blaming the victim. It does make it very difficult to speak out because if you believe that's true, if you believe you deserve this negative behavior, you're not going to go tell people, you know what, I'm the most irritating person in the world. I make my husband beat me up because who could take this? Who's going to help me, right? I'm sorry, the counselor will probably get me. Very difficult. They also stay. Coercion is a big part of the staying, threatening to harm or take the children and the pets, as we just said. Big, big part of the reasons that women stay. And financial's huge. So we move on a little bit. Okay, there are barriers to support services. We do provide services for people who are in the LGBT community, male or female victims, straight or gay, transgender. We don't discriminate. If it's not a person we can bring into the shelter, we make safe arrangements for them and offer them the same counseling services and other support services like legal advocacy and all of those things. But if you're in the LGBT community, if you are transgender, you're in a marginalized community, there's still, in this 2015, a tremendous amount of misunderstanding, flat-out hatred of people in the community, absolute unacceptance, and so it can be very difficult to reach out for help. That's another special needs population, and so they often don't know where to go, that their needs will be met. If you're transgendered and if you're male and you're dressed as a woman all day and that's how you feel comfortable, but you're in a shelter where bathrooms are shared, how do you handle that without revealing something you don't want to, maintaining your whatever sense of self you have? Very difficult. It's very difficult for people in marginalized communities to speak out. Rural areas, it's kind of rural around here, you guys. I drove around like, oh my gosh. Some of the roads, I was like, wow.
No street lights, right?
I was sitting there, no street lights, long winding roads. And if you live there and there's no public transportation, I would imagine is kind of hard to come by, doesn't exist. It can be very difficult. It can be very difficult. Immigration status in shelters, we do take undocumented people. You know, if you're being abused, if you're meet the criteria to come in, there are some reasons that people can. It may not be safe for them or for others, especially if there is a major mental health diagnosis and you're not stable on medication or in treatment, or substance abuse, not stable on medication or in treatment. You may not be safe, we'll refer you to other resources, but a lot of people who are undocumented, the abuser tells them they're going to ship you back. If you try to talk, if you try to help, they're not going to help you. So immigration status is a huge barrier, huge barrier. Abusive partner in law enforcement or military, very difficult. Now I always feel like I have to share that my brother is a police officer, so this is not a slight against cops, but consider if you are the partner of an officer, whether male or female, are you going to be comfortable to go to their colleagues and say, he hits me, she hits me? Even if that department is trained and would be appropriate, are you going to believe that you're going to be supported when those are his colleagues or her colleagues? So very difficult. Military as well. There's another big issue if your partner is in the military or police. What would that be? Guns. There's a gun in the house, and in domestic violence, if there's a gun in the house, lethality goes way up. They're used. They're used against their partner. Alcohol or drug dependency, like I said, if somebody calls, they need shelter, but they use whatever the substance is, alcohol, another substance. If they're in treatment, if they're stable in treatment, we will take them in. If they're not, but they're willing to go for treatment, we'll find a safe resource for them and hook them up. But they don't believe that, right? So the abuser tells them, they're not going to take you, you're a big drunk. And so they believe that. So they very often won't reach out, very afraid to reach out. And language barriers. We do work with Language Line. Are you guys familiar with that? No? So Language Line is a service the coalition that I work for actually pays for it for all of the agencies throughout the state. It's filtered through us. Language Line, it's an 800 number that you call. They have just so many languages. It's wonderful. If we get a call, if I get a Spanish call, we have bilingual counselors. I can always connect them to someone, but we also get a lot of calls from Middle Eastern countries who speak Arabic, different dialects. I've worked with clients from Egypt. I've worked with clients from various other countries. Language Line will get a translator on the phone for you. They have to have the confidentiality that we do. They're not going to go tell, oh, hey, I spoke to this woman from Egypt last night. And look, what did I tell you what she said? But they'll translate. We also try to have bilingual counselors as much as possible. And in shelters or agencies where there's a specific population, for instance, I worked in Passaic. There's a very large population from, not from Russia, from Poland, very large Polish population. So we specifically had a counselor who is fluent, and the Polish-speaking clients were all hers because she could communicate with them. So we try to meet those needs, but these are barriers. When you're working in the disaster shelter, the reason we bring this up is all of this gets amplified, the barriers become greater because resources are stretched thinner. So there are things to be aware of if you're seeing red flags for domestic violence. Okay? Next, please. Okay. Domestic violence and disaster. You guys feel like you need a quick, 5-minute break? Or are we good to go? Good to go on? Great.
Do you need a break?
Nope, I'm good, thank you. Will somebody read, please?
Okay, one client's ex-husband came by and took all the blankets so he would be warm, leaving her and her children in the cold.
Thanks, John. Yes, so when this project started, one of the things my predecessor was tasked with was reaching out to all of the domestic violence shelters in the state and saying, tell me 3 things that you learned from Superstorm Sandy. What was something, a success story? What was a challenge? What was something that you couldn't have even imagined? Tell us something about the clients. Union County, the shelter had to transport clients to the disaster shelter. They didn't have a generator. The abuser came by and took all the blankets. That's what they sent us. Came by, she was with the children. He didn't care. wasn't mad. He was hurting them. That was the goal. Right? Power and control. Power and control.
He got into the shelter and took blankets?
Pardon me?
He got into the shelter and took blankets?
Yeah, because it wasn't the domestic violence shelter, it was the disaster shelter.
Oh.
Yeah. The Morris County shelter had a client who had the violence escalated to physical immediately after Sandy for the first time. So violence escalates when there's a disaster, right? We all get stressed, including abusers, and that increases everybody's emotional level. Next, please. Okay. So, we're talking about gender-based violence because, as we discussed right from the get-go in this, the largest group of victims are female. So that's not to discount the impact on male victims, right? It's just to say that the big population that we're working with is women, so we look at gender-based violence. We look to see what's happening with it. Family and sexual violence goes up tremendously. And I will tell you after, I can't remember exactly which disaster it was, but the local hotline, I think it was Katrina, the local hotline, their domestic violence calls shot up 50% in the week following, and reports of sexual assaults rose 300% in that same time frame. It goes up tremendously. You have to remember, vulnerable people become more vulnerable, right? People who could evacuate did, people who can't become more vulnerable instantly, and who typically can't evacuate? People who already don't have resources. So they're really kind of at the mercy. So, Deepwater Horizon oil spill, in the 3 months following, the calls increased by 13% to the National Domestic Violence Hotline, 21% in Louisiana, which we know was one of the most affected areas. So when I first saw that, I thought, why did that happen? It was an oil spill, so why would that happen?
It was economic, surely.
Economic?
Yeah, it's a refinery.
Yeah, everybody lost their jobs, so people were home and feeling pretty unhappy. Stress levels increased. Money was running tight, right? So violence increases. Violence increases. Abusers, male or female, when things go wrong in their lives, blame their partner, regardless of what the issue is. Blame the victimized partner. Okay? There were floods in Missouri in 1993. The turn-away rate of domestic violence survivors from shelters was 111%. So what that means is, with all the increased calls they got, with any extra people they could take in because of the disaster, still the turn-away rate, people they could not help because they had no room, they were out of resources, 111%. So if you're a first responder and you're assigned to a disaster shelter, and we're going to talk about some red flags, ways you might identify somebody who is a victim of domestic violence. Remember, this is a really dangerous time for them because their abuser is likely feeling more stressed, a little more out of control, a little more apt to abuse. So we have some stats here, and so I did another I did the Morris County shelter today, and I broke my glasses while I was there. And I broke them here too. So I now have, I don't know, what do you call those? Opera glasses? I don't know. So you have to excuse how bizarre this looks. But if I can find these stats for you, they're quite interesting because they just really illustrate the increase in violence immediately following a disaster. So bear with me if you would be so kind, just for a moment.
Did you drop part of yours on the floor there?
Yeah,
by your
I
foot?
did, thanks. It's,
I just don't want you to step on it.
It's the end of my glasses, it's what it is. So, thank you though. Okay, but the stats on these disasters, so that Montreal ice storm in Canada, the police chief reported that 1 in 4 calls in the following week came from women about intimate partner abuse, but the local hotline was down for 2 days. They had no way to get in touch with somebody who could actually help them. The Loma Prieta earthquake in California, that was 1989. The director of the battered women's shelter reported that requests for temporary restraining orders were rose 50% afterwards, and that's where the sexual assaults rose 300%. 300% immediately following. Hurricane Andrew, spousal abuse calls to the local helpline increased 50%. Hurricane Floyd, this one's a little different, and I will tell you the last first responder training I did, I had a gentleman in the audience who could not accept this statistic. So let me tell you, this is an actual statistic, fact-based, gathered by hospital reporting, okay? In the 6-month period after Hurricane Floyd, the rate of inflicted traumatic brain injury in children under 2 increased 5 times, only in the counties that were severely affected by the hurricane. So if you had neighboring counties where one was severely affected, if it was close to the water, if the hurricane hit there harder, and one that didn't, you did not see that increase in traumatic brain injury in those toddlers, in the one that was not affected, but you did in the other. So the gentleman who had a hard time accepting that is because he couldn't believe that somebody would hurt such little kids, but they do. Abusers do. And after a big disaster like this, when everyone is feeling unleashed, when everyone is feeling like the rug has been taken out from under them, people for whom power and control is very important, they feel more powerless, and they feel the urge to get that control much more strongly. That's how they get back on their feet. So violence increases tremendously.